The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
Peter approached Jesus and asked him, "Lord, if my brother sins against me, how often must I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I say to you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times." Or 77 times. That is why the kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who decided to settle accounts with his servants. When he began the accounting, a debtor was brought before him who owed him a huge amount. Since he had no way of paying it back, his master ordered him to be sold, along with his wife, his children, and all his property, in payment of the debt. At that, the servant fell down, did him homage, and said, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you back in full." Moved with compassion, the master of that servant let him go and forgave him the debt. When that servant had left, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him a much smaller amount. He seized him, started to choke him, demanding, "Pay back what you owe." Falling to his knees, his fellow servant begged him, "Be patient with me and I will pay you back." But he refused. Instead, he had the fellow servant put in prison until he paid back the debt. Now, when his fellow servants saw what had happened, they were deeply disturbed and went to their master and reported the whole affair. His master summoned him and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you your entire debt because you begged me to. Should you not have had pity on your fellow servant, as I had pity on you?" Then in anger, his master handed him over to the torturers until he should pay back the whole debt. So will my heavenly Father do to you, unless each of you forgives your brother from your heart. The Gospel of the Lord. Turn that there. This is a joke. I'd like to preface that so in case Father said, I often joke that Jesus and I are very much alike, except I sinned and he didn't. It's a big difference. That's all the difference. That's the big, big difference. We all have sinned and are fallen short of the glory of God. You know, in the Gospels, I don't know if there's too many places where you can see it mentioned as often as forgiveness is in the gospel from Jesus. And it's always, it's the one thing that you can say he's black and white on. It's either yes or no. And that is forgiveness. And he keeps, every time he brings it up, unless you forgive from your heart, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Unless you forgive from your heart, you cannot be freed of the debt. Unless you forgive from your heart, you will go to Gehenna and be there till you have paid the last penny. Because God is, the nature of God is forgiveness. And God never refuses to forgive. Never. Now we can think of the most horrendous thing we can think of. I don't know if I could think of the most horrendous thing I could think of, but even at that, God is open to forgiveness. Because what comes with forgiveness is healing and the restoration of healing from sin in our life. So it's in the nature of God to forgive. Well, then, why is there hell? Oh, sometimes he gets a little upset. No. No. It's still, the nature of God is forgiveness. God does not just select a person and say, well, you're going to go to hell. We choose to go to hell. We do. We can never accuse God of sending us to hell. Never. Because it's the nature of God to forgive. And if a person is willing to ask it sincerely and seek in their heart forgiveness of their sins, Jesus says, God will forgive you. I think I mentioned this here once before. It's a story of the life of St. John Vianney, the only diocesan priest ever canonized he was a pastor in Ars, France. I actually made a retreat there. Very small town. And he used to have people would come to him for confession. First they had to speak French, I think, and then they had to get a ticket, and it usually took up at least 3 days to go to confession to him, because people come from all over the world. And he had the gift of reading souls and so on and so forth. And there was a French woman, it seems like in the book that she's well-to-do. And she was married to a man who was an atheist and never was baptized or anything. And he ended up throwing himself off a bridge. And he died. And his wife made a visit. She heard about this priest from Ars. And she wanted to visit with him about this. She's a devout Catholic, and she went to Ars. She didn't understand that when you get there, it's going to be 3 days before you even see him. And she didn't have time, so she went to the front of the church before she left and was saying her prayers. And the way the author writes is that St. John Vianney was hearing confessions or visiting with people in always such large crowds. And he said, all of a sudden he looked up and he said, just a minute. And he walked up behind this woman and leaned over and said, your husband was saved. Of course, she had never met him, and she had never met John Vianney, he had never met her. She just looked at him and said, your husband was saved. He said, remember that picture of the Sacred Heart you had hanging in the bedroom, the one that he never liked? He always wanted to take it down, but he finally gave in and let her keep it. He said, when your husband jumped from that bridge, he immediately regretted what he had done. And the image of the Sacred Heart came into his mind, and he hollered out, Jesus, mercy. And he was saved. That's what I mean by Jesus is just, he just wants us to accept the gift. Now, that doesn't mean that we can just go and do it as we please, and then, oh yeah, I can always ask for mercy. The problem with that is, if we get in the habit of something, of rejecting God, it's very hard to turn around and ask for mercy. It can happen, but it takes a lot of effort, because we just have never done it before. A famous actress from many years ago, when she was dying, she was on her deathbed, and a good friend of hers was sitting there with her, and she said, let's say a prayer. And she said, no, why should I start? No, I've never done it before anyway. That's what I mean. We can get in a habit of something, and it's very hard to change. That's the problem. But as St. John Paul II says, even at that, when we pass from this life, the first thing we meet is the person of Jesus, and he invites us to accept his mercy. Shows us our life and invites us to accept his mercy. And so anyone who is not in heaven, other than purgatory, of course they want to get there, if a person is in hell, they're in a state of constant rejection. Jesus loves Satan as much as the day he created him, when he was an archangel. It's Satan that rejects, in a state of constant rejection of God. It's not that God is saying, you're out of here, don't come back. It's that Satan has forever and continues to make the choice to reject God. And so God can't do anything about it. And that he's not going to take away his free will. And he's not going to same with us. He's not going to take away our free will, because we can't love him without free will. We have to make a free choice to love. Love always involves freedom. So that's why we have the free will too. But he won't counter that. We have to invite him in. So back to the forgiveness in our lives, to this debtor that he was a servant, just like the other servant. So, and the master of all the servants, who owned all of them, he forgave his entire debt. And then this servant goes out to a fellow servant who's not his master or anything, and he throws him into prison. And that's where Jesus says, unless you forgive from your heart, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So forgiveness can sometimes be an easy thing, or it can be a hard thing. Sometimes we can forgive even when we've been more significantly hurt, let's say, but we know the other person that hurt us had no intention of doing that, and it's easier to work around the forgiveness of them if we clearly see that. But we're not God, so we can't see everything. And then sometimes we can be hurt, and it's severe, and it's unjustified, and it calls for it has severe consequences. So if someone murders one of my brothers or sisters, I'm not going to be happy. And I don't know what I would do, I'd be very angry, obviously. And Jesus says, unless you forgive from your heart, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And so the Irish would probably say, well, we'll see about that. I'm going to do what I want to do. But he says, no, you can't get into heaven unless you forgive from your heart. Now, God is not saying anything about what happened. Somebody was murdered. It has consequences. Unjustly, an innocent person was killed. And we know who did it, and they're in prison, let's say. Now I have to be healed of that. I've been deeply injured. Even though I was the one killed, I was deeply injured by it. Some of my soul was taken away from me by that action. So that person, in a sense, stole part of me in killing my brother or sister. Well, the thing is, who can forgive that? For man and woman, it's impossible in a sense. Only God can do it. And so we have to keep praying. Lord, I don't know how you're going to do this, but I do want to get to heaven. And so help me to forgive. And I know of one guy who actually did that. His daughter was murdered, and then the guy was in prison. I don't know how many years he spent just praying, Lord, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but you say I have to forgive. I don't know how I'm going to do it, so I'll just keep praying for the grace if I'm supposed to. And years he did that. And one day he's standing in front of the Station of the Cross where Jesus is laid in the arms of his mother. He said, all of a sudden this woman's voice deep within him said, they murdered my son and I forgave them. You can do the same. And he said, then that feeling was lifted, never came back. So it is possible for God to do that in us. For us, it's many times probably impossible. But what we do when we forgive, then we take back what was stolen from us. We don't acknowledge that, we don't say it was okay or anything, but we take back what was stolen. In the act of forgiveness, that's what we're doing. We're re-empowering ourselves. I'm not going to let this person hang on to part of me anymore. I'm going to forgive and reclaim what was mine. And it doesn't change what happened, but I need to reclaim who I am and not give it over to them. I think we're all old enough to probably come across people who are just bitter and angry, and the thing that happened or the person they're so angry at has been dead for years. Now, who are they hurting by being bitter and angry? Themselves and everybody around them. And yet they haven't reclaimed what was theirs, and that's only done through forgiveness. So I know it's hard, And sometimes it's impossible, but only by the grace of God. And that's what we have to believe. And Jesus says that to be a full child of God in the kingdom of heaven, we cannot harbor anger, hatred, or unforgiveness against anyone. As one saint, I forget his name, said, be careful who you hate. If you want to get to heaven, you're going to have to love them for all eternity. So remember that. Okay.